This is an exhibition called Metabolic City at the Kemper Museum at Washington University. And it's a show about architecture, and in particular, 3 different groups of architects working in the 1960s who we might think of as visionary architects. And that generally means architects whose buildings didn't get built or never could be built. That's what's visionary about them. The groups here are the Situationist International, represented by a single artist named Constant. He had a one name like Cher. Archigram, which was a group of British architects working in England, and the Metabolists, who were Japanese architects working mostly in Tokyo. One of the things that I like about this exhibition the most is the design. You can see how the designers of the show have built this kind of white enameled curving structure that holds a lot of the drawings and collages on little easels propped up. One of the things that I thought of immediately was different kinds of visions of the future. And in particular, I think about 2001. You know, 2001: A Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick's movie from 1968, which is just about the same time that these architects are working. So the designers of the show very intelligently put together that kind of cinematic vision of the future with the architectural one that's at the very same time. Now over here they've put in a viewing station for a film about Constant's project called New Babylon, and it's projected from the rear on a sheet of clear plexi. And in order to watch the movie, they've given you a couple of comfortable chairs. Interestingly, these are actually, you can see from the label, seats from a Mini Cooper. But you sit down in them and you recline back and you watch the film, and it's very sort of spaceship-like. You know, it's sort of like, open the pod bay doors, Hal. So again, there's that whole futuristic retro vibe going on in the show that fits in just perfectly with the material on display. One of the things that we can ask ourselves when we visit an exhibition like this is, what exactly is the vision of the future that the architects are picturing? Here we have a work by one of the architects in Archigram called The Cushsicle. And it's a sort of cushion pod for a person to be in. It starts out being portable, you carry it on your back, then it sort of unfolds and inflates, and there's a kind of reclining bench with various apparati that you might plug into, and a kind of pod that inflates around it that you can sort of live in. So this is a kind of future that's made for one person alone, alienated from actual society, but plugged into various kinds of media. You know, it's sort of like that 1960s druggy vibe. You know, turn on, tune in, drop out. Over here are some more works by the architects from Archigram, and they show a kind of floating city, a sort of dirigible or a zeppelin that's coming into an English country town bringing all kinds of media. So it's on the one hand about that sort of mass media that's rising up in the 1960s. But we ask ourselves, what exactly is the message of the media? Here, if we look at it, you know, the message seems to be mostly like attractive blonde ladies. So what kind of future is this? You know, it's a future for boys. It's certainly related to other things that were going on at the time, like pop art. You know, you could think about Andy Warhol's pictures of beautiful women, or Roy Lichtenstein's comic strip women. It's certainly not related to the simultaneous movement towards feminism that's also happening in the 1960s. Now, one of the Japanese metabolist architects was Fumihiko Maki, who was actually a professor here at Washington University for a time in the late 1950s and early 1960s, before the metabolist group started. Right across the way from the Kemper Museum is Steinberg Hall, which is a building by Maki from the moment just before he becomes a metabolist back in Japan. The Kemper Museum itself is a later building by Maki, which he builds quite recently, long after the metabolist movement of the 1960s. So it's very nice in that while seeing this exhibition, we're actually inside a Maki building and bracketed by other Maki buildings, even though they're not buildings from the metabolist movement. They are buildings by one of the architects.
So there's a connection, and this is a Maki.
This is a large photo mural of one of Maki's visionary projects. It's a kind of city in the water, it's expandable, you know, it's a very grandiose kind of project. It's a little bit megalomaniacal. Architects tend to be the most self-important people in the world. You know, they want to change everything about the world. They want to change us, they want to change the landscape, they want to change the way we live. This is a good example of that. It's a project that's so grand it's probably impossible to even consider building for real.
And the concept basically is that the city is a living organism with its own life cycles and transference of energy like cells do in the human body. And
yeah, the metabolists saw the city as this kind of organism with circulatory systems and nervous systems. That's true to some degree of all of the architects in this exhibition. This is a reading station that appears here at the end of the exhibition. This is meant to help you understand the exhibition. There are books from the library that you might read, but
I might not read this one, it's in Japanese.
That's right, and you might not want to sit on these hard benches, you know. You pull out the bench, you sit down to look at the library book that's held to the exhibition with a string, and you sort of become part of the exhibition if you do this. This is something that all museums do these days. They put in reading stations. I find it a little bit objectionable and kind of patronizing. The idea that you're actually going to sit down on this bench at this kitchen counter and read a book. You know, they could have done something out in the lobby with natural light and comfortable chairs, you know, an espresso machine, something that might actually encourage you to read a book. Maybe for this exhibition they might have a little bit of tang, you know. The astronaut's drink.
It's basically an optimistic view of society and what architecture can, is it?
I don't think it is in the end. You know, Constance' New Babylon is very dystopian. It's not a utopia. It's a place where you're supposed to get lost in a maze, where you never see the sun, where you don't know what season it is or what hour of the day. Maybe in the 1960s that might have been a utopian vision, but now it seems really, really unpleasant. Just as with Archigram, some of their proposals for cities that walk through the landscape, you know, very sort of forward thinking, but not necessarily a good thing. You just imagine the kind of environmental destruction that such a thing would leave in its wake. I think we're now at a very different point in history where we're much more concerned with the interaction between things that are man-made and the natural world. You know, what we have done as far as building things and our lifestyle is destroying the world right now. So these kind of grand, all-encompassing systems, even though they're modeled on organisms, don't necessarily react all that well with the Earth. So this is a future that we could no longer envision, even if it seemed pleasant. So Metabolic City is an exhibition with 3 different groups of architects whose work we're not necessarily very familiar with because they didn't leave a lot of buildings behind. But you sort of come here, you look at some original objects, you look at a lot of reproductions of things. I came here and I learned a lot more about these architects than I ever knew before. They give us a vision of the future that never was. They give us the way that things might have been if everything had turned out differently. And they give us the sort of ideas rather than the objects from these architects. And those ideas are pretty interesting to think about in terms of both that future that never was and the actual times they were made in. You know, this is architecture that's every bit as much about the 1960s as it ever really was about any sort of future.